Welcome to the Healing While Discovering Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Michelle. I'm an intuitive transformational coach, certified life coach, certified NLP practitioner, and speaker. I've spent the last 22 plus years helping myself and my clients learn how to create their own happiness and live more abundant lives. In this time, I've also overcome and healed from child sexual molestation, a compulsive eating disorder, hunger, and homelessness. Now it's your turn to move forward with your life and heal from childhood traumas or past experiences. In this podcast, I'll share how I was able to overcome all of my past struggles, as well as my personal stories of overcoming jealousy, loneliness, resentment, and bitterness, and how I learned to forgive. I'll also help you explore your shadow self, deal with having low or no self-esteem, and address feelings of not being worthy or loved. Using my personal experiences and extensive training, as well as stories of grief, loss, depression, and anxiety from my guests, I'll help you change your life and finally heal. Hey, love. Did you ever have to mediate the conflicts between your parents when you were growing up? Or did you have to take care of or live in the house with a parent who was ill, or did you face any illness as a child? If so, then there is a possibility that you may not have been able to have the childhood that you had wished that you had. You know, the ones that you saw on TV. Well, I want to invite you to my 90-minute powerful workshop called How to Grieve the Loss of Your Childhood, Surviving Childhood Trauma. Did you know that childhood trauma is more common than you think? And about 70% of adults across 6 continents have reported at least one traumatic experience in their lives. But guess what? Your trauma does not have to be a source of shame. And that's why I would love for you to join me in this powerful workshop, How to Grieve the Loss of Your Childhood, Surviving Childhood Trauma. In this workshop, I'm going to share with you 3 steps for you to begin grieving and continue on your healing journey. We're going to talk about how trauma impacts all of us, what it means to actually grieve the loss of your childhood, and I'm going to discuss the major difference between big T and little t trauma, as well as potential sources of trauma. In addition to all of that, there's going to be a live Q&A at the end to make sure that I answer all of your questions. If this sounds interesting to you, or if you know that there's some childhood trauma that you are ready to release, then I would love for you to join me in this powerful 90-minute workshop. Hey, loves, welcome back to another powerful, at least I believe that it's a powerful episode of the Healing While Discovering Yourself podcast. We are continuing our discussion on attachment styles and why it matters to you. Today, we're going to talk about the different attachment styles and how it impacts you today. And I shared with you in our previous episode, what attachment means, like where it started, where it came from, how it's developed. And so I just want to continue that conversation. And I'm purposely dissecting these episodes, or not necessarily dissecting the episodes, but dissecting attachment styles so that you don't become overwhelmed with this information. Because as I said before in a previous episode, I've been researching this and studying this for a few months, probably close to a year now. So I know it can be a lot. And so I am purposely taking my time and sharing the information with you in a way that you can receive it, take it in, digest it, and then do additional research if you need to. One thing that I want to mention that I forgot to mention in the last episode was I told you about John Boldy and how he was the first psychologist. Blah, blah, blah. I know how to talk. He was the first psychologist / psychiatrist / psychoanalyst to propose attachment theory and what it meant. However, his work was great, but it was Mary Ainsworth who actually made a huge contribution to what attachment looks like and the actual different styles of attachment that we know today with an experiment called Strange Situations. And she decided to, along with John Boldy, they worked together, decided to do this experiment called Strange Situation to basically come up with the varying degrees of attachment, because Bowlby's perspective was that for the most part, when he first proposed it, is that either children were attached or they were not attached. But of course, what I'm learning in research is that the research is really truly never done, because we are evolving individuals. And so we should always have that curiosity. So she wanted to look into that even further wait a minute, there has to be varying degrees. It can't just be either kids are attached or they're not. And so that's when she put on, again, the Strange Situation experiment, I believe in like the 1970s. So she wanted to observe, again, the variety of attachment forms exhibited between mothers and children. So she was another huge contributor. And through her work, they discovered or decided on 3 different styles of attachment. And then later on, there was a 4th style of attachment that was added, which is disorganized. And so I just want to spend a little time talking with you about that, because again, there are implications. The attachment style that we have, they carry into adulthood, right? And then they also impact our parenting styles, which we'll talk about that also. So just a quick overview. What is an attachment? Well, an attachment is a lasting psychological connection between human beings, and an infant needs to develop a relationship with at least one primary caregiver throughout their life, because we are, born to basically be social, right? We're born to connect. At least this is what John Bowlby believed. And what I'm learning so far in my doctoral program, I'm starting to really, truly understand that. And it really helps you understand human behavior. And it's also important to note that attachment is a reciprocal relationship between 2 people. Okay. I also talked about how our attachment style is developed. It's formed with a person who accurately responds to our needs, and it's not necessarily the person whom we spend the most time with, right? In childhood, in infancy, we can spend 30 hours a week with, a daycare provider, but and only 20 hours a week with our mothers or fathers. But if the mother and the father is more attentive to our needs, the child's needs, then the attachment will be formed with that particular caregiver. So it's important not to necessarily look at the time that we spend, especially now when, we're flipping the paradigm of the woman being at home and the husband working or whatever. We're flipping that on its head. And so a lot of women are, feeling guilty about the time that they spend. So to alleviate that fake mom guilt, that false mom guilt, and the reason why I say that it's false is because if we don't believe that there's a thing as dad guilt, then I refuse to believe that there's mom guilt, because it takes 2 people to make a baby. Okay. Whether these 2 people are in a relationship or not, you just can't make one by yourself. You need something from the other person in order to make a baby. Okay. So in order to mitigate that false mom guilt, just know that it's not about the matter of time. It's about the efficiency and the sensitivity in which you respond to the child that forms the attachment. And then, we talked about why it's important to know what your attachment style is, whether you want to do the research and discover what your attachment style was as a child or what your attachment style is today. It's important because, our attachment influences our development from a physical, neurological, cognitive, psychological, an emotional development standpoint. So it's important for us to know, and also important to know that for the most part, a lot of people carry their same attachment style from childhood, infancy, and childhood to adulthood. And so obviously that plays a role in the relationships that we have now. It's also important to note that children develop attachment relationships even with the most neglectful and abusive caregivers. So the question is never, is there an attachment between the parent and this child, or the parent or the child and this caregiver? But the question is, what is the quality of the attachment between the child and the caregiver? Right. And so if you know anything about trauma and the foster care system and all of that, then you understand that you can have a child who has experienced abuse in the worst ways, and yet they still long for that parent. And the reason why they do that is because they have an attachment to that parent. And that's why the work of Mary Ainsworth was so important and so essential, because without her work, without understanding that there are varying degrees of attachment, then we could easily say, or we could easily ask the question, why is this child attached to their abusive caregiver when, the caregiver wasn't taking care of them, they abused them, made them feel bad? Instead, we can take a look at, we can say, this child is acting this way towards this abusive or neglectful caregiver because it formed an attachment. Now, the attachment can either be secure or an insecure attachment. And there are basically there's the insecure attachment, right? Which is the one. And then there are 3 insecure attachment styles, or we can say there's, 3 organized attachment styles and 1 disorganized attachment style. So there are a number of ways that we can look at and consider attachment style. And so I'm going to approach it in this episode and in the subsequent episodes from the perspective of there being the secure or insecure attachment style. So 1 secure attachment style and then 3 insecure attachment styles. So what are the 4 attachment styles? And I do just want to say, if you haven't listened to the episode from last week, make sure you go back and listen to that episode, because it really, truly does lay the foundation for all of the upcoming episodes. And make sure you continue to listen to the podcast, because I'm going to be sharing more information with you in bite-sized pieces so that you can, again, take it in, chew it, digest, do some research. If questions or something comes up for you during the podcast episode, then join me in my private Facebook healing community, which is called Healing While Discovering Yourself. I made it easy. It's named after the podcast. So when we experience consistent care, when our needs are met, it means 3 things. I am safe, I am heard, and I am valuable, right? So the first attachment style to consider or to know more about is the secure attachment. And the secure attachment is formed by having a sensitive and loving caregiver. And it means that our needs are met, and this is from an infant-child perspective. But as I said before, it can easily translate into our adult relationships. And so it's having a secure and loving caregiver, and it means that our needs are met in a timely and sensitive manner. And then also the person who has a secure attachment style, at least the child, they have an ability to connect with others. They are secure and worthy, and they are adaptive when the caregiver or the person leaves them, right? They know how to respond when their primary caregiver leaves. They don't flip out, and they understand that, they will be back, because based on prior history, right, they've always come back. So a child with a secure attachment style will be adaptive to being abandoned. The second attachment style is the anxious avoidant attachment style. And that is created by having an insensitive and rejecting caregiver. And now, if you remember from last week, we talked about the caregiver not necessarily being the parent. Usually it is the mom, but it doesn't have to be. It can be the dad. It can be grandparents, babysitters, nannies. Because if you look at if you watch reality TV at all, and you pay attention to how the children respond to the nannies, when they're younger, a lot of them respond. What's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say like better or anything like that, but you can tell the dynamic of the relationship, and you can tell who the child is attached to. And if they have a really great nanny who spends the quality time with them, they are certainly more attached to the nanny than they are to the parent. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because as the child grows and develops, it actually creates other attachments to different people. But at the foundation, or their primary caregiver or whatever, receives the most of their affection, if you will. And even as they get older, like when they become teenagers, and let's say the nanny is still around or they aren't, they still have this greater affection for them. So again, anxious avoidant is insensitive and rejecting caregiver. That's what creates that attachment style. And a child who is anxious avoidant avoids eye contact with the caregiver when the caregiver returns, after a brief separation, or they ignore their caregiver altogether, right? It's like, for example, like a person who is, a mother who goes on vacation, and her attachment to her child is, let's say, or the child has an anxious avoidant attachment style. When the mother goes on vacation, and then when she comes back, the child is kind of like standoffish and just like, nope, don't want anything to do with you. And they show distress when the caregiver leaves, right? Again, they avoid interaction with the caregiver, and then they show very little. I meant they show little distress when, I think I said they show no distress, but they show little distress when the caregiver actually returns. They feel unloved and rejected. And this is usually the result of, let's say, like abusive or neglectful parents. So the third attachment style is anxious resistant. And this is a combination of the caregiver being insensitive and inconsistent in responding to the needs of the child. Now, as I'm sharing this with you, I hope you're able to see how this translates into relationships as adults. Okay. I hope this is making sense. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But again, I just want to put that out there. I hope this is making sense. It's having an insensitive and inconsistent caregiver. And the child, right, is very cautious in the presence of a stranger. Their behavior is disrupted by the caregiver's departure. And then when the caregiver returns, the child appears to want to be close to them, but they're also angry, and it's hard to soothe or comfort them. Again, they're angry and confused. And this is the result of poor parental availability. Like when the parent is not emotionally available to the child, does not respond to their needs, then they develop an anxious resistant style. And then lastly, in the first three styles that I mentioned are considered organized styles, or from a different perspective, there's one secure and then two insecure styles. And this last style, which is disorganized, is another insecure style. This is when the parent exhibits like atypical and even, I don't know if this is a stretch, like apathetic behavior towards the child. And this child basically has, no strategy, no way of coping when either the parent leaves or when the parent returns. Their behavior is unpredictable, right? And it's difficult for them to express their feelings of extreme fear, or they're just like so confused. And in this situation, the child avoids or resists the caregiver altogether, and this is the result of inconsistent caregiver behavior. It's the caregiver who, on Monday, the child is crying and the caregiver is, oh, sweetie, baby, and is always there for them. And then the next day, the child is crying and the parent just completely ignores them. And of course, it has to happen over time in order for this relationship or whatever to be developed, right? So it's not just one day you're like, as a parent, you have days where you're just like so over it. And that's the truth. I don't know how many people gonna say that, but as a mother of two beautiful, lovely children, especially when they were younger, when they were infants, I was so over it. Right. So it's not just that you have one day where you're like so over it, then you're going to break the attachment between your child or lessen the attachment between your child. It happens over time, right? It's having this consistent behavior that is inconsistent. So it's consistently being inconsistent. That creates a disorganized attachment style. And so how does our attachment style as a child, how does that impact us today? So I've said before, generally speaking, early attachment styles continue throughout all of our relationships. And our attachment style, this is how it impacts us today, or another reason is that our attachment styles have an impact on our parenting styles. Okay. Stay tuned to the podcast because I'm going to talk to y'all about parenting styles. I am putting this PhD education to use, y'all. Look, I want to share these things with y'all because it's so important on our road or our journeys of healing and self-discovery to just at least have a basic understanding about some of these things so that we know that we're not alone and that we're not crazy and the things that we're experiencing are a part of our normal development. You know what I mean? It's like if you had a parent who was neglectful towards you as a child and, you lived your whole life that way and you tried to do the best that you could. And, you did what you could, you got whatever education you could. And then you have a child of your own and you begin to display neglectful behavior towards them, even though like, I don't want to be like my mother. The reason why you eventually become like your mother, especially if you don't heal from that experience, right, is because that is your default. Right. And so knowing these things, again, on a journey of healing and self-discovery, just really helps put things in perspective and let you know that you are not alone. Okay. So your attachment style as a child, as an infant, it influences your parenting style. So people tend to base their parenting style on the way that they were raised as children. And what's even more interesting is that it's passed through generations, right? And so if you have someone who had a resistant or let's say a disorganized attachment style, and they grow up and don't necessarily get the help, and then they have children, right? For the most part, they're going to raise their children the same way they were raised. And a lot of times we say, oh, well, my mother did this to me and I turned out fine. And, reality is like, well, yes, you are fine, but, and so we pass that down to generations because then if the kid has a kid, without any healing, without any intervention, we repeat the same cycles. And then, lastly, the way that it impacts us today is, in our romantic relationships, right? Because the internal working model influences a person's expectation of a later relationship, and then it affects our attitudes towards them, right? Because as a child, we make these mental, or we create these mental representations, we create these constructs, if you will, and they become our core values and beliefs, whether we call them that or not. They just become ingrained in us. And so we base all of our relationships off of the way that we had a relationship with our parents. And that's just the way it is. And the only way that changes is, again, if there is some sort of intervention, right? Whether it's coaching, whether it's therapy, whether it's just, the school of hard knocks, school of life, right? If there's no intervention, then again, the cycle continues. So I hope that was helpful for you. If you have, if you're listening to this and you have more questions now than you did before I started this episode, I want you to join my private Facebook healing community called Healing While Discovering Yourself, named after the podcast, because I go live on every Friday. And it's an opportunity where we basically continue to digest the podcast episode. And I answer all of the questions that you may have regarding this week's or that, the current week's podcast episode. So if you have more questions, do a little more research if you want to, which I encourage. And then join our Facebook group. You can go to Facebook and put in Healing While Discovering Yourself in the search engine or search feature on Facebook, or you can go to andreamichelle.com/groups and join the Facebook group. And I will be there to answer all of your questions. And stay tuned, because the next episode of our podcast, we're going to talk about adult attachment styles and what they look like and just all of that good stuff. So thank you so much for being here. And as I go, just know that the love in me salutes the love in you. Hey loves, are you looking for a safe place to hang out while you're healing with other like-minded individuals? If so, then I would love for you to join my private Facebook community called Healing While Discovering Yourself, named after the podcast. This community is for those who are truly seeking a safe place to heal and also show up authentically. If this interests you, then I'm going to invite you to go to Facebook/groups/healing while discovering. I look forward to seeing you in the group. What would you do if you knew that in 5 minutes you could take back control of your life, calm your nerves, and shift into your power? You would take advantage of that offer, wouldn't you? Well, I would love to share with you my proprietary The More method. It's a method that I use every day to help me take back control of my life and master my inner world. See, I don't know if anyone has ever told you, but you are not just a physical being. You are not just a spiritual being, you are a multi-dimensional being. And that means that you are spiritual, you are mental, you are emotional, and you are physical. The More method is designed to help you truly take back control of your life and master your inner world, every area of your inner world, so that you can show up authentically and unapologetically. Go to themoremethod.co. Again, that's themoremethod.co to download the video and amazing guide to show you how to take back control of your life and master your inner world in as little as 5 minutes a day.